He is considered to be one of the most brilliant thinkers of the 17th century, not just by the Christian world, but also by the secular world, because of the theological and the philosophical knowledge and wisdom that he had. But in the spring of 1750, he was fired from his pastor's position. There were 253 voting members and 230 voted him to be dismissed. Who is he? Jonathan Edwards. Keep listening as we talk more about him. Hello and welcome to the Arpana Saladi podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in once again. If this is your first time, welcome to my podcast. I'm so glad you are listening to us. And if you are a regular member, please do leave us some ratings and some reviews so that it will be helpful for us and encouraging for us. So, we were talking about Jonathan Edwards. This is a grim reality of his life, and if you all know who Jonathan Edwards is, for people who do not know, he is one of the great revivalists, and he is a great preacher, a great pastor, a great father. And this man, the minimum life that he lived, he impacted the Christian world to such an extent that even people like Martin Lloyd-Jones have been inspired by his writings and by his teachings. If you are somebody who has listened to Jonathan Edwards' sermons or read his writings, you know what kind of a man he is. And March 22nd, especially, the reason I'm doing this podcast today and tomorrow, that we will be talking about Jonathan Edwards, it is a prominent day for us because that is the day that Jonathan Edwards went to be with the Lord. And, you know, when we look at his life, Pastor Robert Murray says, Jonathan Edwards, when we look at him, his light, it makes us wonder how feeble does my spark of Christianity appear beside a sun. But even his was a borrowed light, and the same source is still open to us. That allows us to understand what is the amount of impact, example, influence that Jonathan Edwards has on the present day Christians. The life that he lived is such an exemplary life that there are volumes written about his work, his ministry, his life, and the way he handled things in very difficult situations. So today, I just want to tell you about one major event in his life that really touched my heart and the way he left an example for us. And I'm sure this is an example that a Christian needs to follow. Like I told you in the beginning, yes, though Jonathan Edwards was a great mind that we know after he passed away, while he was yet alive, his church was not filled with people who are so big fans of Jonathan Edwards and starry-eyed people who were looking up to him. No, they were not. There was this person called Bernard Bartlett, member of the Northampton Church, and this guy, you know what he did? He distributed a pamphlet in 1735, and what was written in the pamphlet? It was written that Jonathan Edwards was as great an instrument as the devil had on this side of hell to bring souls to hell. The church there in Northampton was riddled by this propaganda which was happening about Jonathan Edwards. And through all of this, Edwards must have battled loneliness, and the only real friends that he had beyond his family were his younger pastors like Joseph and David Brainerd and another handful of pastors in Scotland who befriended him through correspondence. Because basically, in person, Jonathan Edwards was an introverted person temperamentally, and intellectually he was brilliant. Physically, he was very frail. Interpersonally, he was retiring. Psychologically, he was intensely introspective. Spiritually, he was enchanted with gospel. And as the historians never fail to tell us, he was a little stiff relationally. So you cannot make friends so easily with Jonathan Edwards, because it says that Edwards spent 13 hours a day in his study for stretches for his life. But in the economy of the way God works, it's often those who appear most aloof and unpleasant on the outside who prove themselves to be the most trustworthy and delightful Christians in reality. On the other hand, those who appear most immediately magnetic, easygoing, happy and gay and joyful upfront turn out to be the most frothy and unreliable Christians I have seen them in my life. So Edward's church troubles came to a head in 1749 to 1750 because he had issues that he was presenting, theological disagreements over the Lord's Supper, over who needs to take the Lord's Supper and who should not be taking the Lord's Supper. And he was really very careful and stern about people who are not regenerate not touching the Lord's table. So because of his firm stand on this subject, and especially Edwards was standing against his grandfather who was his predecessor, and he was saying that this is the order of the church, this is the church discipline, and we need to follow this pattern. When he was being so stern about it, tongues wagged, eyebrows were raised. In February 1749, Edwards proposed that he preached about this change in terms of admission to communion. But the leaders preferred that Edwards should not preach on that day. Instead, they asked him to print his case and submit it. Nobody were ready to listen to him. He wrote in one of his letters to one of his friends called John, he said, "A very great difficulty has risen between my people relating to qualifications for communion at the Lord's table. My honored grandfather, my predecessor in the ministry over this church, strenuously maintained the Lord's Supper to be a converting ordinance and urged all to come who were not of scandalous life, though they knew themselves to be unconverted. I formally conformed to his practice, but I have had difficulties with respect to it, which have been long increasing till I dared no longer proceed in the former way." Basically, what he's writing here is that he was standing against his grandfather and saying that do not allow everybody to take part in the Lord's table. There is a proper order. Let us follow this order. But this put him in a lot of trouble. Another trouble was spiritual apathy from his congregation. Now, we may all think that, because it is Edwards preaching consistently in his church, it is so wonderful to sit and listen to him. But he complained at one point that his church members would stretch themselves out on the pew to sleep while he preached. Jonathan Edwards preached. Perhaps even more cutting to the heart of a faithful pastor is not outright rejection, but boredom and being ignored while he was preaching the very truth of the Word of God, which we are trying to listen now and read his sermons. Because of Edward's stand for the truth, he was kicked out of his church, though he came back to preach because the congregation had trouble finding suitable pulpit supply in the subsequent months. Edwards spent the next 7 years in an even more remote part of his country preaching and ministering to some Indians and few white families, even though Edwards knew that they voted him out and they didn't want him to be the pastor. He stayed there in the parsonage for 15 more months because they couldn't find another pastor. And he preached to them even though he knew that they rejected. Isn't that wonderful? On July 1st, 1750, Edwards preached one of the most remarkable sermons that any pastor could ever preach. And he preached his favorite sermon from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 14. "As also ye have acknowledged us in part, that we are your rejoicing, even as ye also are ours in the day of the Lord Jesus." This was Edward's favorite sermon. This sermon is remarkable for its gravity and its tenderness because he did not have any grudge. He did not hold any bitterness towards anybody. And because of its love and certainty and the evident deep trust in God, which was expressed by this great preacher. One of Jonathan Edwards' colleague, he writes and he says, "I never saw the least symptoms of displeasure in his face the whole week when this voting was taking place, but he appeared like a man of God whose happiness was out of the reach of his enemies and whose treasure was not only a future but a present good, overbalancing all imaginable ills of life. Dear Christian, do you understand? This man of God was kicked out of his church, but yet when they called him, he came back to preach because the congregation did not find a better pastor, but he did all of this in love. In the light of the adversity that he faced, Jonathan Edwards believed in God's sovereignty. In spite of the pain, in spite of what was happening in his life, he believed in God's sovereignty. So here is the question. God's sovereignty in your life plus your pain is equal to what? Is it trust in God? Like Jonathan Edwards showed us as an example? Or is it divine coldness towards God? Or is it fatalism? What is our response in such circumstances? When it comes to Jonathan Edwards, we know and we can see through his life that Edwards had happily settled with this thought into this conviction that the entire universe and all of human history, his very own life, even he believed that even the footfall of an ant were the outworking of a heavenly rule and a plan so comprehensive that they know no ceiling or boundaries, and he believed in the sovereignty of the one who provided everything for everyone on this earth. So when ordinary faithfulness earned him the rejection of his church members instead of their embrace, Edwards did not go into psychological meltdown because he already had a deeper embrace held by one whom Edwards knew ordered all things. You see, when 230 people voted to fire him, Edwards knew that it was God who was dismissing him from that church. Why get bitter at the people? A greater mind was ordering his life. God's love was working through their hate. And why? To get him to another place where he would write several of his most enduring treasures at the height of his intellectual powers, which we are reading till today, to bring to fulfillment God's deeper purposes for his life and 1,000 other reasons we won't know till we reach heaven. 7 years after he was sent out of his church, he became the president of the university, now which is Princeton. But after that, Jonathan Edwards died from complications related to smallpox inoculation. Jonathan Edwards' doctor, Dr. William Shippen, he said, if dying well is an art, Edwards was a master. And he described the pastor's posture on his deathbed as cheerful resignation and patient submission to the divine will through every stage of his disease. This attitude towards death was not a last-minute relinquishment, but a lifelong resolution. And Edwards' dying words provide us a simple reminder. He said, trust in God and you need not fear. Let us, like Edwards, rest in the sovereign care of our Creator as we move towards that better celestial city. So let us all trust that whatever happens in our life happens by the sovereign will of God, and all that matters to us is how do we respond. Let us respond like this man, Jonathan Edwards. It is a life worth imitating. Thank you so much for listening till now. You were listening to Arpana Saladi. I will see you all in the next episode. Take care and bye-bye.